So we are going to start. I'm going to teach you, just like I said, in 20 minutes, something that is going to give you a brand new and an accurate understanding of how the federal government was meant to work, the relationship with the states. It's going to be something you were never taught and would never be taught in school or college, right? And we're just going to take it right from the source here. This is my little pocket constitution that I got when I was a freshman in college, if you can believe it. So we're going to start with the first line, okay? The first line of the Constitution, not the preamble, but the first line of Article 1, okay? There you go. So if you have your little pocket constitution, pull that out, Google it up on your phone, whatever you kids do nowadays. Just go to Article 1, Section 1, the very first line of the Constitution, okay? So here we go. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States. Now, if you just read that, all you think is Congress is one of the three branches of government. We need to break this down. So we're going to break it down word for word, just about, if you can believe that, and you're going to see that it makes all the difference. Now, I'm going to tell you about first, how do you go about defining the words that are used in ancient documents? Okay. Well, our founding fathers, one of the guys in the Founder's Recipe book, and one of the men that they quoted all the time was this guy, Edmund Burke, okay, a Swiss guy who wrote a book called The Law of Nations. Now, he called it the Law of Nations because it dealt with the relationship among independent sovereign nations, okay? And that is what our founding fathers believed they were doing and were doing when they tried to form a union with the Constitution proposed in 1787. So they used this as a guidebook, and we will too. Now, in this book, I will take you to Book 2, Chapter 14, Section 206, wherein, so you can see that it's here, wherein Mr. Devato writes, the public compacts, which is an ancient word for contract, which is what the Constitution is, just read the Federalist Papers, the public compacts, called conventions, articles of agreement, etc., when they are made between sovereigns, differ from treaties only in their object. What we have said of validity of treaties, of their execution, their dissolution, the obligation and rights that flow from them, is all applicable to the various conventions which sovereigns may conclude with each other. In other words, what he says of deeds and agreements, it applies to contracts as well, and that's what our Constitution is. And here is what Mr. Devato said regarding how you interpret those words. Okay, so if you go to Book 2, Chapter 17, Section 272, the interpretation, he says this: when, therefore, an ancient document is to be interpreted, we should be acquainted with the common use of the terms at the time when it was written. Pretty simple. And that knowledge, so the acquaintance with the use of the terms when it was written, is to be acquired from deeds, documents of the same period, and from contemporary writers, so writers who wrote around the same time that the contract was made, by diligently comparing them with each other. This is the only source from which to derive any information that can be depended on. Okay, so you've got this. This is what he's saying. You go, in order to interpret a contract, you have to know what the words meant at the time it was formed. We still use that in the law. We call it a meeting of the minds. When you make a contract, you have to know what the words, you both have to have the same understanding of the words at the time it was written. So here's what Devato says. Go to documents written at the same time, people who wrote about those things at the same time. So that's what we're going to do. So let's look at the first word, all. I think we all know what all means. All doesn't mean some. All doesn't mean many. All means all. Legislative, all right? Legislative is simply a Latin word meaning lawmaking, okay? All lawmaking power, so the power to make laws. So in this federal government that the Constitution is creating, all laws, right? All power to make laws says what? All legislative powers herein. Okay, why did they bother saying herein? Why not just say all legislative powers? Why all legislative powers herein because that meant if there's a herein, there's a here out. There's something outside of it. They're drawing a border around certain powers, the powers given to the federal Congress. So I want you to come with me on this little trip to Federalist number 39, written by James Madison. So if you want to look it up, here it is on my iPad, but Federalist number 39. It says this: in order to ascertain the real character of the government, so the government being proposed in the Constitution, it may be considered in relation to the foundation on which it is to be established, to the sources from which its ordinary powers are to be drawn, to the operation of those powers, to the extent of them, and the authority by which future changes in the government are to be introduced. So now he goes on and he says, on examining the first, the Constitution is to be founded on the assent, the agreement, ratification, approval of the people of America. How? Given by deputies elected for that special purpose. On the other, this assent and ratification, so this approval and this agreement and approval, is to be given by the people not as individuals composing one entire nation, but as composing the distinct and independent states to which they respectively belong. Who created the Constitution? Not one nation, not the people of one nation, the people of each independent state electing special delegates for the purpose of deciding whether or not to agree to enter the new union by accepting the Constitution. And so he says, it is to be the assent and ratification of the several states derived from the supreme authority in each state, the authority of the people themselves. The act, therefore, establishing this Constitution will not be a national, but a federal act. That it will be a federal and not a national act, as these terms are understood, the act of the people as forming so many independent states, not as forming one aggregate nation. James Madison. So why is it herein? Because there's a here out. And what's the here out? The powers of these 13 at that time independent nations. He said, we are not one nation. The people will not vote as a nation on the Constitution because that doesn't exist. We have, he says, the several independent nations, and the people of each one of those will elect deputies who will decide whether or not to accept the Constitution. Let's go to Federalist number 45, also written by the illustrious James Madison. Yeah? Federalist 45 says this: the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain, something can't remain somewhere if it hasn't already been there, right? Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people. Federal government, few and defined. Where are they defined? In the Constitution, herein. Do you understand? All power to make law in the federal government are herein defined, right? Because as he said, those are to be few and defined powers. Most of the power remains in the states that decided to create this Constitution. So when it's herein, what does that mean? It means those in the document, meaning the federal Congress. All right, herein granted. Now, granted is not just a fancy word for give. They weren't sitting around at the convention and someone said, "Oi, James, why don't you Google a fancy synonym for give?" And he's like, "Granted, let's say granted." No, that's not what happened. What happened was they used the word granted on purpose. All legislative powers herein granted. Let's look at granted by looking at what that word means in Samuel Johnson's dictionary of 1786. Now, in that, and I have it there, in that dictionary, it says, in the law, grant means a gift in writing of such a thing as cannot aptly be passed or conveyed by words only. They use the word granted as a legal word, meaning all the powers that were being herein granted, were being done in a grant, that all the powers were going to be defined in words only, as required by the definition of the word grant. They were not being given powers. They were being granted powers. They use that word specifically, guys, meaning it's either in this document or they don't have those powers. All right? Granted. Samuel Johnson's dictionary, 1786. These are things that must be given in writing, not in words. Okay? So, herein granted shall be vested. Now, vested, what first shall be? Why shall? Why isn't it all legislative powers are granted or are vested? Why not? Why is it shall be vested and not are vested? Because of what we find. Skip over to Article 7 of your little Constitution, right? If you skip over to Article 7, the last article, it says this: the ratification of the convention of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states so ratifying. So they had to have at least 9 of the 13 states agree to this before this ever went into effect. So why does it say vested? Because vested in the law means something has to happen, some event has to occur before you receive some privilege. If you work for a company, some companies will pay you in stock and they will vest after you've worked there for a year or 5 years or whatever. So what they were saying in the Constitution is these powers herein that we're granting in writing only to the Congress of the federal government shall be vested, provided at least 9 of the 13 independent sovereign states agree to accept the Constitution. So shall be vested if that thing happens. All right. Now, for the last word, Congress. Shall be vested in a Congress. Now, look, these men were very educated men. Our entire war for independence was fought because the Parliament and the King of England were violating our rights as Englishmen. All you need to do is look up any of the documents written at that time. Look at the Declaration of Independence. We complain about the King and Parliament. We were English colonies. We knew that the lawmaking body of the government was called Parliament. So why did we not call our lawmaking body, why did we not call it Parliament? Because of a very plain reason, plain to them, completely unknown to us, and would never be taught to you, because it would turn upside down the narrative taught in school that we are one nation and that the federal government is superior. Not true. Complete rubbish. Let's look at Samuel Johnson's dictionary again of the word Congress. Okay? Samuel Johnson, 1786 dictionary. Congress is an appointed meeting for settlement of affairs between different nations. Settlement of affairs between different nations. Okay? That's what was being created. The federal government was called, the federal lawmaking body was called Congress because of what it was already explained to you. Because of the idea that Madison expressed in Federalist 39 and 45. Because of the idea of herein granted. That these 13 states, now 50 states, were meant to operate as 50 independent sovereign republics. Okay, so you have that Congress as defined in Samuel Johnson's dictionary. I want to read you. Do you remember what Duvall said? He said, you go to things written at the same time and by contemporary writers. So I want to take you to a letter. Well, it's actually a speech. Edmund Burke, a member of Parliament, was making a speech in the town of Bristol, England. It was the 3rd of November, 1774. Mr. Burke was there, and the citizens of Bristol were complaining that their will wasn't being done in Parliament, that they, as citizens of the town of Bristol, were not being represented in Parliament. And Mr. Burke said, because you're not represented in Parliament. And here in this speech, the 3rd of November, 1774, Edmund Burke, look it up, speech to the electors of Bristol, he explained the difference between a Parliament and a Congress. Remember what Samuel Johnson said, a Congress is a meeting for settlement of affairs between representatives of different nations. Edmund Burke says, Parliament is not a Congress of ambassadors from different and hostile interests. So what is Congress? Congress is a meeting of ambassadors from different and hostile interests, which interests each must maintain as an agent and advocate against other agents and advocates. But Parliament is a deliberative assembly of one nation with one interest, that of the whole. In other words, why did we get all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress and not a Parliament? Because our founding fathers, from all the information I just gave you, intended that those states would be independent nations coming together to exercise a few and defined powers for things that affected them all. For everything else, those numerous and indefinite things that affect the life, liberty, and property of people in America, those powers what? Remained in the states. That was finally expressed clearly in the 10th Amendment. If you want to go to Amendment 10, those powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people, reserved. Now, I want to go back. So do you understand that? We named it Congress on purpose. So now in 20 minutes, I've told you more than you would learn in 4 years of high school and 4 years of college. All legislative powers herein granted shall be, if 9 of the 13 agree, vested in a Congress, not a Parliament, a Congress. And now I want to say one last thing. All lawmaking powers are in Congress. Executive orders, not law. Regulations issued by agencies, not law. Supreme Court opinions, not law. And it's not my opinion. You learned it from the things we just read, but I want you to look, guys, at Article 6, wherein the supreme law for the states is defined in the Constitution. Again, something you'll never be taught. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, meaning according to the powers defined in the Constitution, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. If our founding fathers intended for the president to make law, it would be listed as part of the supreme law of the land. It isn't. If our founding fathers intended Supreme Court decisions to be the law, it would be listed as one of part of the supreme law of the land. It isn't. All lawmaking powers in the federal government reside in the Congress, which is a meeting of ambassadors from independent countries with powers that are numerous and indefinite. Boom.
Yeah, this is kind of funny because this is my original pocket constitution that I got when I was first taking a few years ago took all of the courses that we're offering now, and it literally says it's like given, not granted, legislative, and here we are.
Here we are.
Circle.
And that's 20 minutes of what I normally take about an hour to teach. And we break down, that's that Constitution and government class. We break down the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation and the Bill of Rights. We break those down. And all those things that led up to it, the Mayflower Compact, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, we break down all those things so that you can really come to know not just what is in the Constitution, but why those things are in there and what they mean. Don't just let stuff roll off you or listen to what someone says or assume that 5 black-robed 80-year-olds on the Supreme Court can tell you what the law is. They cannot. Don't assume that the president can sign a piece of paper that says, I'm going to here define who's able to own a gun and who isn't. That's not the law either. These, in this Constitution and Government course, that's the sort of thing. And Mr. DeVottle that I referred to, you will spend a week on him. If you get the course, that video will be ready for you. You'll have a whole week of Mr. DeVottle and other guys who explain the same things.
Yeah, so now we're just going